Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you here for tonight's program. My name is Julie Taberer, and I'm a trustee with the Grand Rapids Historical Society, and I also manage the Grand Rapids History and Special Collections Department at the Grand Rapids Public Library. Just a couple of quick announcements for tonight. You might be joining us in Zoom, and you may also be watching on YouTube. So either place that you are in, you can use the chat to say hi to people or to ask questions. And on Zoom, you can also use the Q&A feature to ask questions. And that's kind of the best and easiest place for us to see questions on Zoom. And if you're on YouTube and you're asking questions in the chat, I will pass those over to Liz here in Zoom. Liz is open to answering questions as she goes during the presentation, so you can put those in at any time, and then we'll also have a time for questions at the end. And we're also working on the next program for the Grand Rapids Historical Society, so that will be in early April. And it will likely be on the East Grand Rapids neighborhood with Mary Dersch from the East Grand Rapids Public Library, so we're looking forward to that. Watch the Historical Society website and Facebook page for more information. I will introduce Liz, and we will let her get started on the program. Liz Keegan has been the Director of Education and Outreach for the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan since January of 2006. She's responsible for developing and implementing education and outreach activities, and she's provided extensive technical fair housing training to more than 7,875 housing industry members in more than 350 sessions covering a variety of different things. Prior to joining the staff full-time, she worked for the Fair Housing Center as an independent contractor for 5 years, coordinating the center's annual Fair Housing Luncheon and Workshop series. And in addition to that series, she's responsible for coordinating the center's annual Lakeshore Breakfast, the curricula for elementary, middle, and high school students, as well as adult English as a second language students. Keegan has served on the executive committee of the Ottawa Area Housing Coalition, now the Lakeshore Housing Alliance, since 2009. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Liz has to share with us tonight, and I will let her take it away.
Thank you so much, Julie. I am really excited to be here with all of you tonight on Zoom, and for those of you watching on YouTube, I really appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate the opportunity from the Grand Rapids Historical Society. It's been a lot of fun to look into our history and think about where we live and how that matters and the journey for fair housing in the greater Grand Rapids area. So I do want to, of course, thank the Historical Society for the opportunity and the Public Library for the partnership, the hosting, and kind of all of the prep work to do this tonight. And of course, special thanks to Julie for providing even a little bit of material for the presentation. Very grateful to some of our funders who help us provide this educational opportunity to you, including the Kent County Senior Millage under the County of Kent. We are funded through the Area Agency on Aging of Western Michigan, and I will share a lot of links with you in the chat. And so I encourage you to watch for that so that you can kind of follow along or refer back to some of the things that I'm going to introduce tonight and share. But we have some tremendous resources under the Kent County Senior Millage, so I want to be sure to highlight that. I don't want to assume that everyone knows what fair housing is, so I am going to just tell you a little bit about fair housing before we dive into the program. And I intend to move back and forward through time to kind of illustrate some of the points in our past that we may not know about related to fair housing, and also look at how it applies today. So it's important that we understand what fair housing is. You might have been drawn to the talk this evening because so much of what's happening in our housing market in West Michigan feels unfair. I've heard offers, over 60 offers received on one home for sale in less than 24 hours. So how competitive is that? People signing up for waiting lists for rental opportunities and waiting long periods of time to hear back about whether they get the apartment. So we have a very limited stock of housing. And so it's very challenging to access that. This was happening before the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of our issues, but fair housing laws are actually very limited into the protections that they offer. They're intended to promote housing choice for individuals free from discrimination based on protected classes that exist at the federal, state, and local levels. So where you live actually can dictate what kind of fair housing protections you have. And here in Michigan, we have protections, and in Grand Rapids, Kentwood, Wyoming, we have protections as well. But it's really all about allowing people who are otherwise qualified to pursue the housing that meets their needs, free from being treated differently because of any of the protected classes here. I think a lot of people understand that race, or maybe even color, meaning skin color, are protected classes, but there's a lot more listed under our protections, as you can see here. It's illegal to discriminate against someone based on their national origin, where they're from, their gender, which now, as of last month, includes sexual orientation and gender identity under the definition of gender under fair housing. It's illegal to discriminate against somebody because of their religion, whether they have a physical or mental disability, whether they have children in the household under the age of 18, whether or not they're married, what their age is, unless it's a senior community and unless it's in compliance with the 2 existing age standards that are allowed in terms of age standards set forward under Housing for Older Persons Act. You can have 55 and older communities, 62 and older communities, but we typically are not going to want to see any other age as a limit in Michigan because of that law. And then Grand Rapids has an extensive list of additional protections. You can see them here, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later on. So within the city limits, if you're joining us, and a few of you shared based on your zip codes, I know you're here, a couple of you are close by and maybe in the surrounding areas, we have protections that apply to us. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited to kind of stop and talk about the history is that I think now more than ever, we really understand that housing is at the center of our quality of life, and having equal housing opportunity, which is our little logo here in the middle of our black circle, is critical, because where we live dictates access to education, health, jobs, the ability to accumulate wealth through home ownership, transportation. Are there parks nearby? Is there a grocery store? Can you get to a pharmacy? All I think highlighted really in this pandemic, when we've been ordered to stay home or stay close to home for so long, we're more and more understanding of the value of the location of where we live being so closely tied to the amenities in our everyday life. This is a really startling quote, but I think it's an important one to consider in light of our topic tonight. The housing market and discrimination sort people into different neighborhoods, which in turn shape residents' lives and deaths. Bluntly put, some neighborhoods are likely to kill you. And if you, like me, are thinking of potentially violent incidences when you hear that quote, that is certainly one element of it, but something that we're coming to better understand is the environmental impact of our housing and where we live, and kind of the history of what's come before us in our neighborhoods and where we're spending time. So the benefit of having this opportunity to look back is that we can really think about some of those things that have impacted where we spend our time, and we better understand through studying where we live, and that connection of how we live, even to the point where if you provide your zip code, there's studies that can tell you what your dental health is. There's studies that can tell you what your educational attainment is likely to be, simply based on your zip code. Here we have a tool from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And again, this is one of the links that we'll share with you, where you can plug in an address and it can, tell you where, in most addresses, some that I've plugged in, it hasn't worked, but I can always find something nearby thanks to Google Maps, your life expectancy based on an address that you plug into this online tool. So I looked at 3 different, actually these happen to be senior housing communities in the Grand Rapids area. They're only 4 miles apart, and we start with a nice number of 83 0.1 years. Kent County is just under 80 as an average life expectancy. So this location of this community for those older adults is higher than the county average, and indeed higher than Michigan and the United States average. So looking pretty good. As we move further north, we lose a few years. Now we're kind of right at that, or very close to the Kent County average, and we would expect to live only 78.9 years. And then we look at a downtown senior housing community, and we realize that, oh gosh, we're starting to see some differences here that can be very significant. And as I said, these are only, really about 4 miles apart, looking at 32nd Street to Fulton. So how did we get to the point where we've got segregated communities, where we've got this history that we're going to explore tonight? Part of it has been government policy that's been implemented and strictly enforced in our history. There's a history of segregation by race in our residential practices, housing policies, tax policies, lending programs, and also the practice of discrimination have contributed, along with private market housing practices, to contributing to that widespread racial segregation. Michigan is a hyper-segregated state. We have a lot of segregation by race in the Midwest, so Michigan is not alone, kind of in the Rust Belt, but we in West Michigan are not immune to that. And part of the journey is looking back and understanding, how was access to housing restricted? So we're going to look at restrictive covenants. This is one from Seattle from the 1930s. These were legal covenants attached to residences that restricted, as you can tell, who had access to even visiting the property or working on a residential property, let alone owning or renting, leasing any part. So I recreated this language because that scan of that historical document in Seattle is a little hard to read. No property shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. It continues, only white or Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy any property except a domestic servant actually employed by a white person is spelled out as an exemption here. We also see Washington, D.C. This is an example that was very specific, and again, using the language of the time from the 1930s, restricting any persons of Negro blood, any persons of the Semitic race, blood, or origin, and got very specific with what they called racial descriptions, including Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, or Syrians. So these were attached to individual properties or sometimes communities, developments, housing developments as a whole. And it was illegal for individuals of these various groups to access these home ownership or rental housing opportunities. We uncovered, with the help of our partnership that got us here tonight, a restrictive covenant from Kent County. And again, I recreated the language in case that's challenging to read. The herein described premises are not to be sold to or occupied by any person with a perceptible strain of Negro blood. Again, using the language of the time, this is attached to a deed. You're seeing 1949, but this likely would have been put into place earlier and applied going forward throughout much of our history. What I wanted to then kind of correlate jumping forward is, what's the life expectancy for that neighborhood regarding this particular location just outside of Grand Rapids? And they were pretty good at 80 plus years of life expectancy. So not among the lower numbers that we saw earlier. So hopefully a good housing opportunity, but it was set aside and made exclusively available for white residents. Something that I think is really fascinating, I haven't seen this done, but I would love to have this as an opportunity to have students or volunteers dive into this type of conversation, looking at what we're going to look at here out of Muncie, Indiana. This county employee who's very well versed in mapping software, something I am not at all versed in, actually was able to put the locations of racially restrictive covenants onto a map. So those are the red shapes. So those were communities, developments, or individual homes that had racially restrictive deeds or covenants attached to them. He layered it with the percentage of non-white residents from 2010 census data. So again, we're looking at a 1930s tool, which was really utilized until the late 40s before they became illegal, but quite honestly were continued in use beyond when they were struck down as illegal for several decades. We're layering that with the current racial makeup of the community, and we're seeing that a lot of the red shapes are more light gray or don't show any residents that are not white, with the exception of a couple there in the center of the screen. So these mapping tools really help illustrate how history is still having an impact on our access to housing today. Even though these practices have been outlawed for some time, the impact, the ripple effects of those policies and actions going forward seem to have maintained or supported some racial segregation. It's also, as I mentioned, illegal. Not only did they strike down restrictive covenants, but there's also a lot of laws that prohibit housing discrimination in the transaction on behalf of housing professionals like real estate agents, landlords, banks. Here we have language directly regarding the prohibition of the refusal to sell or negotiate or offer a home for sale based on a protected class. This is an example of a real estate agent asking another real estate agent, literally asking, what's the race of your buyers? This was a case that was reported to our Fair Housing Center. The real estate agent who got asked that question was offended because she knew she didn't have to answer it. She knew that this was a potential fair housing violation, and she didn't really want to believe that she was being put in this position in this day and age. The listing agent went on to kind of say, she's asking this question because this is an exclusive community. People here are funny about other people. This was a home for sale on a small lake in Northwest Kent County. And finally, because the second real estate agent was not being complicit with her attempts to find out the race of the interested potential buyers, she literally told her the title work has covenant restrictions. So this is within the last, I think, 5 or 8 years, where we have a current, sales opportunity referencing covenant restrictions that have been struck down as a tool to try to get another agent to be complicit and potentially discriminate on the basis of race. Another tool that a lot of people are familiar with, and maybe it's what drew you in tonight, is to better understand the homeowners loan corporation maps, or they're called redlining maps quite often. This group, the HOLC, was formed in the 1930s. They were the corporation was created to help lenders and borrowers who were really impacted by the foreclosure crisis of the Depression. They were created to buy failing loans, extend the terms, so really leveraging a lot of government support. In doing that, they mapped over 230 communities of certain size. I think they had to be 100,000 people or more at the time to be mapped by the HOLC in the 30s. They created these residential security maps to kind of standardize appraisals across the country. So valuators were kind of disseminated across these communities. They filled out same form for each neighborhood. And you can kind of see the legend here where the color, the redlining color, comes from. This is the Grand Rapids key or legend. It's a little bit on the pink side, but that D is a failing grade. Yellow, is C, blue is B, and green got the first grade, A. So you may have experienced similar grading in your schooling. Part of the question, or one factor that they were taking into account, was to determine whether or not there were incompatible racial and social groups present. So they were looking at who was already living there. And they also actually were asked to kind of forecast out who's going to continue. Are the same populations going to stay in this neighborhood? Or do you foresee a change in social or racial occupancy? And the belief was that those changes would lead to instability and a reduction in property value. The evaluators were also asked to look at natural or artificial barriers that would prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and keep out adverse influences, including, this is the language of the time, they wanted to prevent infiltration of business and industrial uses in a residential neighborhood. That might make sense. However, they included lower class occupancy and inharmonious racial groups. So really they were evaluating who was already living there, who is likely to live there, and are we going to invest in this community, really substantially help these neighborhoods recover, or are we going to withhold some of the benefits that would have been attached or available based on an A or B rating? So as I mentioned, there were over 200 communities mapped, and this is really fascinating because you can see right away that there's a difference in how the dots look, and the larger the color of the dot within each ring is representative of how much of the geography scored on that 4-tier system. So you can see Sioux City, Kansas City, Wichita, right there in the middle of the country, they have largely red circles. We can barely see the yellow and blue and green around Sioux City. That means that a lot of Sioux City was redlined. So this, I think, is really interesting to see. And again, you'll have a link to this Equal Opportunity Index, to where they've tried to really make these maps accessible so that everybody can see the individual neighborhood profiles. We have a local resource I'll talk about in a moment that's done that for us. But we're not alone in having experienced quite a bit of the redlining mapping. As you can see, Michigan has a number of communities that were large enough at the time to be included. So the Grand Rapids Historical Commission website has the Grand Rapids HOLC map up, and you can click on the different shapes and open a separate document with that form that gives you kind of the color commentary as to how that evaluator kind of collected information and made some remarks, off-color remarks sometimes, about the status of the neighborhood, including the people in the neighborhood. So you'll see Julie is putting the links to some of these pieces as we kind of scroll through. So thank you for keeping up with us and doing that in the chat and the Zoom. So pardon me. So the Grand Rapids map here, I think this is really interesting. The high volume of yellow and red neighborhoods, over 80% of Grand Rapids got a C or a D score. So for those of you who are familiar with and living in Grand Rapids, you know, we're making a lot of top 10 lists. There was a lot of energy and excitement about Grand Rapids really doing so well and attracting so many people, growing, all these positive things, the beer city, and you know, a lot of unique art-based events. We've been growing, but when we look back almost 100 years ago, it wasn't forecast out to be a great place for investment. So we've managed to prove them wrong in some ways. We were mapped in the fall of 1937. So if there isn't a color in the neighborhood, it wasn't residential, it wasn't settled, or it was industrial. So they were really looking at the residential neighborhoods. And as I said, this is an interactive map provided by the Historical Commission. So it's really interesting to click through and look at the different forms. There's a lot of information that they were collecting. They were looking at the geography, any sort of natural features, literally the lay of the land, what was the slope or green space. Here you can see favorable influences included city facilities. This is where our office is located, at the corner of Holland Division. So a positive was close to the South End Industries, the Division Avenue Business District at the time. But you can see also they noted the detrimental influences included the type of inhabitants. And further below here, you can see they marked a presence of Italian families. And again, using the language of the time, that there was a presence of Negro families and also relief families. So families that were receiving some form of government assistance. So they forecast this neighborhood trending down in terms of desirability. Near the Baxter Community Center in Sherman Union. This one has kind of stood out to me as I've looked at a lot of these over the years, in that the clarifying remarks, the open area at the bottom of the form, includes a space where the evaluator actually made this comment about the Black residents in the area being of what they called a better type, and then located or shared location-specific information about where those specific populations were living. So a little bit of an exercise to have you look at your screen for a moment, kind of visualize the shape of the Grand River, and really hold the yellow and red shapes in your mind, if you would, because we're going to flash forward and look at a racial dot map and look at the population of each neighborhood or the city of Grand Rapids by race. And then we're going to kind of look back and forth to kind of compare who is living in the neighborhoods that were undervalued or devalued in terms of the redlining. So if you would look at those red and yellow shapes, and this, I tried to line it up with the river here for you. And we flash forward to the racial dot map here. This is 2010 data. It's available, it's a map of the United States, so we're going to share that link with you too. The blue dots represent white residents, the bright green are Black residents, the red dots are Asian residents, orange is Hispanic residents, and then brown, which is hard to differentiate at this Zoom level, is listed as other race, Native American, or multiracial. But you can see that we have segregation based on race, based on kind of the way that the dots cluster. And I'm going to scroll back. And again, so you can look at the C and D scoring neighborhoods. And then scroll forward and see that we have higher populations of people of color living in those communities where the government opportunities and funding was really withheld or discouraged or much harder to get. So there's a relationship from our 1937 map to our 2010 reality. So kind of jumping forward to the 1960s, a lot of people aren't familiar with the fact that Dr. King was a part of the fair housing movement. They discussed it as open housing at the time. He and his family actually moved into a West Chicago tenement building known in the area to be a slum, and did so intentionally to highlight the lack of quality of the housing and really force people to see through the media exposure that he could bring what the reality of living in some of these communities was like for individuals of color at that time. Dr. King and other marchers were physically attacked and were really surprised by the violence that they experienced in the North. I think their assumption was that they would have more allies and it would not be as violent as what they had been experiencing in the South. It got to a point where he actually canceled a march. And if you think back to your civil rights history and what many of the marchers went through in various locations and the level of violence that they experienced, for him to cancel something like this shows the level of concern that they had, and also the unknown of doing the work that they were trying to do in the North. Eventually, he did return to the South with his family, leaving Reverend Jackson in charge of the Chicago efforts. We really encourage you to look at the Chicago Freedom Movement website, learn a little bit about that space and time, and see some really rare color photos of Dr. King and Coretta Scott King in Chicago, taken by a fair housing guru. So I bet a lot of you are familiar with, or maybe we're expecting to hear about the Auburn Hills story here in Grand Rapids. If it's new to you, I really encourage you to check out City Within a City by Todd Robinson. There's a really nice deep dive. I can't do it justice tonight into the, the politics and the history and the hard work that went into this effort by 4 Black Grand Rapids men attempting to buy a 20-acre residential plot from the city on the northeast side with the intent of developing housing for themselves and for others. They wanted a community where white, and again, using the language of the time, white and Negro persons both have an opportunity to buy our homes. In response to their efforts, after their first bid was denied and the price was set higher, a White Citizens Committee was formed in response. This is something that you might have come across in A Raisin in the Sun as part of that play that was based on a true story that author and her family experienced, tried to have neighbors organize and push a Black family out. For sale signs went up in the bordering neighborhood that was a white neighborhood. And they were really many attempts to stop this purchase from going forward of all kinds. There was a lot of debate, local politicians involved. They did prevail, and 3 of the men did build homes there and raise their children. This is off of Fuller Avenue and Sweet Street, if you're interested in the location. The author of the book, Todd Robinson, credits the story of these gentlemen with facilitating a passage of a fair housing ordinance here in 1963. So Grand Rapids does have a rich history of being a part of this push-pull and the dialogue and the hard work of establishing equal housing opportunity. I thought this was a really nice piece in the Grand Rapids Times. This is from 2016, but one of the last of the 4 gentlemen that was still surviving was honored by the Grand Rapids Public Museum. They hosted a special proclamation ceremony declaring May 28th in 2016 as J.E. Adams Day. And this is an image of the coverage provided by the Grand Rapids Times. In 1966, nationally, this is where the idea of how do we prove housing discrimination kind of solidified in a process that we still use today. It's called testing. A lot of people compare it to the idea of secret shopping. It's much more intensive than that, but the concept is really the same. In the 60s, they put together white couples and black couples and had them visit housing opportunities, real estate agents, to find out how people were going to be treated. They were comparably qualified in income, background, number of children, all other attributes being otherwise equal. The only difference that they had was their race. So any difference in treatment would have to then be responded to in terms of were they treated differently because of their race. That was the only variable. So as I said, that's something we still do today, and I'm happy to talk about at the end. Also in 1967, Grand Rapids had a riot. This is a photo of the corner of Pleasant Street and Jefferson Avenue from the Grand Rapids Press. This was not uncommon. We were maybe a year ahead of a lot of the others, but there were enough riots happening to where the president put together a commission on civil disorders. It became known as the Kerner Commission for the Chair. And they issued a report that actually became a best-selling book across the country. And it includes the infamous quote, acknowledging we have all this disrest, people are not satisfied. And they concluded, our nation is moving towards 2 societies, one Black and one white, separate and unequal. In 1968, on April 4th, we have the tragic assassination of Dr. King. He was in the South working on sanitation worker rights when he was murdered. This is Jesse Jackson reviewing news coverage of the day. And 7 days later, after years and years of attempts to pass civil rights legislation that included housing rights, President Johnson is seen here signing the Fair Housing Act with the housing section intact. That was something that had been fiercely debated, fiercely opposed. But they felt that they could not hold off any further as a result of what was happening and people further demonstrating, communities being really torn apart. There was an impetus to do something, and President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. It gave us our first 4 protected classes: race, color, religion, and national origin. Color meaning skin color. Here in 1977, we had a really interesting, again, another role in looking at inequity in Grand Rapids. The Easttown Community Association president and his successor, who eventually worked at the early days of the Fair Housing Center, are quoted here in the advocacy that they played, highlighting issues related to redlining and really trying to push for change. Their efforts and alignment with groups across the state led to the passage of the Mortgage Lending Practices Act of 1977. So again, here we have Grand Rapids actively evaluating access to housing opportunity and understanding the barriers and the cost to individuals for being left behind. HUD, revealed great data in 1979. This was a story in the local paper about a national study highlighting that housing discrimination is still being suffered by the Black population in spite of the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Here in 1979, over 3 days, the Grand Rapids Public Schools sponsored a community conversation, and here's the cover to the report that is really an interesting look into the thinking and the efforts of the time. But one of the things that brought the group together in looking at, who's accessing education and human services and where are they living, the conference acknowledged the need to provide adequate housing for everyone, and that neighborhoods were still segregated, schools were still segregated because the neighborhoods were. So when a committee was established, it included representatives from 2 area cities, the junior college, or now community college, and even area realtors were involved in this early access conversation. The inside of the report kind of gives us a timeline, which I think is just great documentation to look at what was happening again in Grand Rapids at the time. There's city efforts here to kind of evaluate some of the things that were happening. They're looking at, the freeways potentially displacing people, riots occurring, fair housing ordinance efforts, human relation commission efforts, looking at poverty guidelines, public housing. Further in, we actually see the Urban League and again, the local Human Relations Commission organizing to prevent blockbusting, which was the practice of real estate agents really going door to door and saying, to white homeowners, did you know that a Black family bought the house over here or next door or behind you? Kind of creating that panic selling atmosphere, profiting off of it, and really changing the makeup of stable neighborhoods. So again, in the 60s, this was an effort happening here. There's a lot of history here and I'm moving quickly, so please do use the Q&A if you have any questions for clarity. But we have a rich history. I was really pleased to kind of take a moment to explore and share this with some of you. So in the spring of 1980, the committee decided that fair housing was the way to go. Again, at the junior college, they wanted to look at, testing in rental and sales. They wanted to look at educating people about fair housing, especially educating real estate agents, the community at large. What's the legislature doing? What are local communities doing at the municipal level? They also wanted to be there to take individual housing complaints and be a good partner with other organizations that are working on anything related to fair housing. I am so pleased and proud to say that 41 years later, we are doing all of this work. The people that set our Fair Housing Center up in Greater Grand Rapids in the late 70s and early 80s really created a solid agency that has sustained and works with both the industry and the community to further fair housing, to try to ensure equal housing opportunity, regardless of who is at the table, because it takes all of us to do this work together to succeed. We got a $1,500 grant from the Dyer Ives Foundation, kind of startup money. This went to one of our Articles of Incorporation signers, one of our early founding members, Ms. Townsend. We were incorporated as the Greater Grand Rapids Fair Housing Center on September 4th in 1980 as a nonprofit. So we don't have enforcement authority. We're still a nonprofit. That hasn't changed. Okay, so we're switching topics a little bit, looking at our map again so we can kind of think about this historical framework and how we were graded, looking at our spaces, looking at our river, looking at the redlined areas. And we move forward to 2015 here. This was provided, I think, through the city of Grand Rapids. There's percentage of non-white population using similar colors. So I thought this was really interesting to help us understand, again, more recently than the racial dot map from 2010, looking at Grand Rapids specifically, the racial makeup of the Greater Grand Rapids neighborhood based on 2015 American Community Survey data. So I'm going to flip backwards, hopefully, and again, have you kind of think about which neighborhoods were kind of highlighted for investment and which were left behind, so to speak. And look at the red neighborhoods here have the higher percentage of non-white population, yellow being second highest, blue and green, so kind of the inverse of our colors. But again, you can see some overlap with the communities of color residing in those neighborhoods still as of 2015. Here in Grand Rapids in 2019, the Community Relations Commission, which is the longest serving civil rights commission in the state, passed more protections. They have added to fair housing and human rights protections over the years, but this is a recent landmark effort that expanded our protected classes here to include actual or perceived color, race, religion or creed, sex, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, national origin, genotype, age, marital status, medical condition, disability, height, weight, or source of lawful income, meaning where does your money come from? Is it legal and verifiable? Can we count it towards your household income to help you qualify for housing? That can be a voucher, that can be disability income. Social Security income, you name it. So we have a lot of civil rights and human rights protections here in the city of Grand Rapids as a result of kind of this journey. Something that I think is really helpful to understand, this is data provided from Zillow. I thought this was really interesting. I included the HOLC map there as a frame of reference, but you can see it recreated in their modern shapes without kind of the landmarks. But they correlated the value of the homes as they are broken down by the neighborhoods and their HOLC scores. So the green or A-graded neighborhoods, you can see, are maintaining high home values over 400,000. The B neighborhoods have experienced a significantly less value, but still close to 200,000. And the yellow and red lined neighborhoods have really not had the type of return on that investment. So really understanding the home values as a result of that framework of redlining. This is also provided by Zillow median home values. So kind of another way of looking at that data of where the higher home values are, again, in correlation with which neighborhoods scored higher on that HOLC map. The city of Grand Rapids has also provided kind of these snapshots of different types of data throughout the city. And you can kind of see, for example, the poverty rates are pretty close, again, to kind of those neighborhoods that experience less investment or active disinvestment as well. So we're just better understanding kind of the history of what happened in our community and what relationship that might have with people who are living there now in terms of their educational attainment or their income level. We have not really gotten terribly far away from that instinct to draw lines around or label or separate. This was a map that made the rounds around social media probably more than 10 years ago, but it really struck a chord, both positive and negative, with folks as they disagreed or liked or laughed or felt uncomfortable or felt challenged or were angered by how their neighborhood was portrayed here. There's an instinct to filter, to label, and I thought this was really illustrative of that. I work in a neighborhood that's simply labeled crime, and that really took me back when I saw that. And others were, labeled irrelevant or talked about the type of income or the fact that it was charmingly shady. So we've not moved away, I think, entirely away from that instinct. So another learning opportunity from an outside community that was redlined coming out of Richmond. And this is, again, kind of how does this history matter today? So this is a New York Times story. It's really beautifully illustrated, and you can kind of scroll through it on their website. And again, we'll provide you that link. These were the neighborhoods that were redlined, a lot of surface area redlined here in the 1930s in Richmond. These were marked as risky investment areas. These were residents or neighborhoods that had Black residents. But what they were looking at was where the hottest parts of town now are and where that lines up with redlined neighborhoods. And you can see some of the hotter areas do exist in those redlined and disinvested areas. That's probably not a surprise, but it's interesting to layer the data that way. They also then conversely looked at where is it cooler to live? And as we're all about to spring forward this weekend, hopefully spring and summer are on the way. Think about the quality of life that comes with heat waves and access to the ability to keep yourself safe and healthy for older adults, for people with disabilities, for families with very young children. When you have, for example, neighborhoods that have not been included in tree planting, your air quality suffers. These were already potentially areas that were, as you can see in the center of the map, next to an industrial area. So we're better understanding the harm of living close to industrial areas that were not well controlled, what it can do to our groundwater, what it can do to the earth. We're better understanding lead poisoning, lead paint usage. So again, literally the environment that we spend time in correlates directly with our health. And with this is a quality of life and air quality issue. A lot of red line neighborhoods didn't get the same amount of tree coverage. They further mapped parking surface area. And of course, that really can increase or exacerbate heat waves or high temperature days. So areas that have a lot of kids with asthma, or as I mentioned, older adults, or just not the ability to have the cooling air conditioning units or, central air, fans, all of that that's needed to help with that quality of life. These neighborhoods have more pavement, which traps and then reflects that heat. So again, we'll share that link with you, but a really interesting layering of modern data and things that we're thinking about in terms of quality of life, layered with that redlining. Thank you. Julie's doing a great job keeping up with all of my links. So, and you're welcome to reach out to us at the Fair Housing Center or me, Liz. If you would like these, I can email them to you, share them. I'm very happy to do that. So I wanted, again, kind of spend a little bit more time about what's happening in fair housing now. So nationally across the board, we've seen a shift that might surprise you. If you're new to fair housing, you'll see that we've got, almost 59% of the cases across the country were disability-based discrimination. We do have race-based discrimination. You can see these are the different entities that accept fair housing complaints. We would fall in the purple category. We are a member of the National Fair Housing Alliance. Most private fair housing centers like us are. But of course, there are government venues for filing complaints and processing complaints. And those are included here kind of in that breakdown. But a lot of race-based discrimination, a lot of sex-based discrimination, discrimination against families with children, and based on national origin. But really leading that trend is disability-based discrimination. That's been happening nationally for about 15 years. Maybe 12 to 15 years, I'd say that shift started to show up in the national data. We saw it in 2015 here in West Michigan for the first time. And as you can see, we almost had 100 cases of disability-based discrimination here in West Michigan out of 184 allegations that were brought to our attention. We had 31 cases related to race and or skin color discrimination. People can file on multiple bases. Families with children are still experiencing discrimination here. That was our #1 issue between 2007 and 2014. You might recall the housing bubble burst, the foreclosure crisis, economic recession. A lot of families were displaced. A lot of homeownership opportunities were lost as people then went into the rental market, which was not necessarily very welcoming to all families, families with a lot of kids, multi-generational families, larger families. We've also had a trend, a slightly smaller bumps in gender-based discrimination and discrimination based on national origin or where you're from. If you have an accent, if you're from a different country. We've seen sexual harassment come out of our gender cases. And we also see just, kind of that flat out stereotype of, oh, I only rent to men because of this, or I only rent to women because of that. So those cases tend to be a mix there. Heavily, our caseload in 2020, in spite of the pandemic, continued to be rental, just over 50%. We also saw 31% of our case was a failure to accommodate people with disabilities. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about what that is and who that impacts. But we did see sales discrimination in spite of the pandemic. Home sales continued. They're continuing at such a quick rate that it's challenging to illustrate when housing discrimination does occur. We do see harassment, sexual and otherwise. I'll talk about more of those examples in a minute. But you can see here, there's all kinds of housing related transactions where discrimination can be a part of the process. I'm watching the clock, so I'm moving a little quickly, but jot any questions down and let us know. I'd love to talk to you a little bit before we wrap up tonight. So protections for people with disabilities, older adults with disabilities, include the accommodations, as I mentioned, and modifications. Well, Liz, what are you talking about? Modifications literally allow physical access. So if something that can be done with a hammer and nails, or something that you can kind of change and touch with your hands, it's typically going to be a modification. Swapping out the type of doorknob may not seem like a big deal, but if you think about whether a door is usable to somebody who is not able to grip and turn, or it's very difficult or painful to grip and turn, having a lever style doorknob that you can kind of hook with your wrist or your elbow can literally open up spaces, rooms, amenities, full enjoyment of somebody's housing. In Michigan, for the most part, these need to be allowed, but they need to be done in a way that is safe and at a cost that's reasonable. And we can help with that. The big issue, that the blue slice of or red slice of the pie, a lot of our cases are a failure for people with disabilities to be granted changes in their rules, policies, procedures, and services in their housing, not just rental housing. It can be in a sales transaction, it can be in a homeowners association, or as part of a condo association, asking for permission to have an assistance animal, for example, or having a designated, assigned, accessible parking spot set aside for your individual use so that you can freely come and go from your housing as a person with a disability or an older adult with a disability can make huge day-to-day difference in quality of life. Another trend that I said I would circle back to is related to that harassment. You might have seen some stories across the country, specifically Asian older adults have experienced harassment, have been attacked. This is echoed in information from the FBI. A lot of hate crimes take place near residences, in or close to a residence. And sometimes the message is related to the fact that they're not welcome in the neighborhood. This is 2017 data, but the newest FBI data, upheld that the largest portion of hate crime incidences are still occurring near homes or at homes. You might have seen this from last summer when a Black tenant came home and found that somebody had written "No Blacks Allow" on his door. After that was removed, he returned and somebody had written KKK and WLM on his door. So that creates that question of, am I safe? Am I welcome? What do I do? Should I stay here? Can I afford to move? Can I break my lease? And these are all things that fair housing laws prohibit. You can't harass, you can't intimidate, you can't coerce someone to leave their housing because of a protected class. But this is also something that I think people think is history and doesn't happen anymore. This actually occurred in a senior community. The media blurred out the N-word, but underneath it, you can see somebody wrote "move" on this older African-American woman's door when she moved into an apartment in a senior community. So this is, something that happens periodically through, I have a number of examples in my time at the Fair Housing Center where people feel that this is something that they can do. It's very hard to find who did it. But it's devastating to the person who experiences it. And this is something that we've seen in senior housing before as well. We've looked at discrimination specifically, how seniors are treated based on race or skin color, and seniors with visible disabilities. And we have found also seniors of different national origin. We've found evidence of discrimination at a higher rate than we normally do in our investigations in the normal course of our work. So almost 1 out of every 3 minority seniors or seniors with a disability will have an additional barrier seeking housing, which is really challenging. It's hard enough to get senior housing, let alone in a pandemic, let alone in a very popular market. If you're of color or have a disability, it can be a lot harder. We also see a lot of ads that show a preference just through the use of human models. You may notice a trend here. This is something that we do tend to see a lot across a lot of marketing, not only senior communities. This is just happens to be examples related to senior housing communities, versus being inclusive, showing people with disabilities, different national origins, different skin colors, which is our preference from a fair housing point of view, of course. There's all kinds of things that can happen across all of the protected classes. People being treated differently because they're married or not married, older applicants being asked, can you live alone? Can you take care of yourself? Can you prove that you can take care of yourself? Or if you need help, we're not going to let you move in. Refusing to allow those changes that I mentioned. We had a situation where we had an over 90-year-old asking a landlord for handrails at the front door and down to the basement where she could do her laundry, and that was refused. Not allowing people to use mobility devices or motorized wheelchairs, things along those lines are all signs of differences of treatment. Separating residents by age or by race. We've had cases where people have been, darker skinned residents have been put at the back of the building, people with visible disabilities put in the back of community developments where they're not necessarily seen by people touring the property or visiting. Wanting to meet or see someone in person to see how they function or what they look like or what they sound like could be a sign of fair housing violations. And housing providers who don't provide medical services collecting health-based information is a trend. There's been some really big cases, and it's certainly something that we don't want to see in independent living communities. So the good news is we're still here. We can help. We can take any questions. You can contact us. We'll listen to what's happening. If you're not sure if something is an issue, please contact us. Our services are free. You can report discrimination anonymously. You can come right to me and I'll take it to our team. You can call our office and let us know you don't want to be affiliated. But we really need eyes and ears to help us understand who's facing barriers. Is it related to a protected class? What can we do about it? And if you do experience discrimination, you're in charge of what happens with our Fair Housing Center. We let our clients really lead through the different mechanisms that they can choose to enforce their fair housing rights. We can write letters, we can do education, we can teach classes. We can also connect you with attorneys, help you file complaints with the Department of Civil Rights or HUD. We are here to meet the community's needs and will really work very hard to do anything to further fair housing. So this is a whole series of kind of extra. If you're really looking for more information about the history, there's a great timeline available. There's a really neat animated video segregated by design. It's about 20 minutes, but it really dives into the HOLC and does a really nice job, much better than I ever could. I'm not a historian. I'm a fan and student of history, but I'm not a historian. So I encourage you to check out that video to look at HOLC maps and what they've contributed across the country. And again, I showed you the racial dot map and the mapping inequality map. I encourage you to check out the Kent County Senior Millage and all the resources that are available for 60 and older adults. We are so fortunate to have the whole set of resources there. I really do want to encourage you to think about getting involved, but I also please really encourage you, let me know what I can do differently. Whoops, let me go back, click too fast. Please fill out our survey, our evaluation. I want to hear from you guys what I can do differently, what information I missed, what suggestions for improvement you have. Our funders really love to see the feedback from all of you, and also to help us understand, since we're doing this online, what's better, what meets your needs. Other ways you can engage with us, you can learn about being a tester for us. We do pay small stipends for our tester volunteers. We're only doing phone and email testing right now. If you're interested in reading, we have a whole list of books that we have read that have fair housing issues in them. We can even help you host your own. You can share what you've learned, invite us to speak with groups that you're involved with. We love to connect. We have all kinds of programming in the schools. You can join our mailing list, you can donate, you can come to our event online on April 22nd. We're hosting a Fair Housing Month conference for the first time in our 33-year event history. That will be online. So you can visit our website for more information about that. But I also really want to pause and see what questions you may have, and hopefully get to answer those and hear from all of you. So again, just one last plea to take our survey, and let me move away there. And welcome Julie back.
Thank you so much, Liz. Just listening through the whole thing, I really appreciate how you're combining the historical elements, both local and national context, and then wrapping it into so much current data on everything from housing values to health, and just so it's really complex, and you wrapped it up very well. Thank you.
So I covered a lot. So you all take a moment to digest, take a moment to type out your questions, because I'm not a quick typer. So I want to say, take your time, type out the question. We have time.
Yeah, Yes, absolutely. And if you are watching on YouTube, there's a chat feature, a live chat where you can enter questions there, and I'm watching that also.
Mhm.
And there were a lot of links while you were talking, Liz. I put them all in a Google Doc, and I shared those in both Zoom and on YouTube, so you can see all the links there. And then,
That's
as
great.
Liz mentioned, she shared a survey, and then you get 2 surveys tonight. There's one from
Oh,
the
yes.
Historical Society also. So there are both of those links. We appreciate your feedback. And I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I get to ask my question. It's exciting. Um, I've wondered this with the HOLC maps before, and you mentioned tonight that 80% of Grand Rapids was C or D rating. Do you know if that was normal in other cities or was that unusually high?
That is a fantastic question. And until the Mapping Inequality Project created that nationwide map, I I assumed that we were maybe that was maybe a little bit more rare to have that much of the community scoring that way. But then you could see by the different size and color of the rings of those dots that it very few were higher scoring as the majority of the map. So I think that we're not alone, but I feel, especially given how Grand Rapids has grown and really thrived, that I hope we're not unique in that recovery, but I do think that we're a little bit unique in that we've had a significant number of barriers to overcome. We have not come all of the way. You can see based on the current information that we are still struggling with equal opportunity across the board. But there were some communities, their dots were almost all red. And so if you lived in a redline neighborhood or you were a Black individual looking to purchase, you were limited to those areas. So you were directed towards a community that was being undervalued or devalued and really kind of left out of future opportunities, future investment. Infrastructure was neglected. So there were lots of things that people could change through zoning, through policy, through private investment. People couldn't change the color, right? You can't control that of their skin and who you are when you're born. So some of the municipal barriers could be addressed if the community had the will. And I think in a lot of ways that's been done. But I think it's really important to remember that especially people of color were just not allowed that home ownership opportunity. They weren't able to build that generational wealth, or the homes that they bought were in communities that have not been able to thrive. So their return on their investment, as we saw, was much lower. So the ripple effects of all of that are really pervasive. The other thing I want to share too is, even real estate agents who are trying to do the right thing could face losing their license or penalties like fines if they broke tradition and wanted to promote, integration. If they took that risk, they could lose their livelihood, have to pay fines. Of course, it was a very fraught journey for Black homeowners to move into a white neighborhood. We have lots of stories of people being really under siege living there. And that's something that unfortunately we still see today. I recently read a story of a Black homeowner in a largely white neighborhood. He actually happened to be a senior, he's retired at home. And after the events of this last summer, he shared online that he was afraid to go running and jogging as he had been doing for a long time. It was really neat because he shared it on a neighborhood-based app, and it started a twice a day group walk. People would come be with him, walk with him to ensure his safety. So in terms of, the historical timeline, and again, I'm not a historian, but I feel that so much of what we were looking at and thinking about and talking about tonight is very, very relevant. More so now. I've been at the Fair Housing Center for 20 years, and in the last 18, 24 months, looking at this history and the dialogue that we're having, it's really relevant. And I'm hoping that we can learn from the luxury of this little study of history tonight. And again, I love this opportunity. I can't thank you guys enough. To really then think about, okay, we better understand the costs and how do we get creative and how do we find some solutions so that we're not really fully repeating history.
Yeah, and I agree. Understanding the depth of what's happened is important for understanding what needs to happen in response to that. I want to share a comment that's on YouTube because I know you're not seeing those ones
Yes,
right now.
Thank you.
Hugo says, amazing presentation, very interesting and informative. These issues are very much on my mind. I would love to connect.
Great. I'm going to actually pop my email into the Zoom chat.
Okay, and I'll pass it on over to YouTube.
Thank you.
Yes. And then we have a question here also. Great presentation. Do you or people you know live in areas in Grand Rapids where they are a racial minority in their neighborhood? What is their experience like as a white person in the inner city or as a Black person in the majority white suburbs, for example?
That's a really great question. This happens. There's a lot of stories. Some of our clients in our historical case load and currently have been among the first or among the few. And sometimes it goes very well, and we don't hear that. We unfortunately are contacted when there's an issue. And I have to say, sometimes the property managers or housing providers will connect with us because they know their residents aren't welcoming this individual or this person with a disability or this national origin, of somebody they've never had that experience with. So we hear, unfortunately, when things go wrong or when they're difficult, that's our job. We want to try to educate and reach out. We can educate the neighbors that they're not allowed to interfere with somebody's housing choice. We can help the housing provider provide that information. As individual neighbors, we don't have the right to say what happens unless we own that property or we're leasing it. And that's why these laws exist, to make sure those housing professionals aren't perpetuating some of that discrimination. The list of protected classes is long, but we have cases and allegations related to all of them. So the protections are still really necessary. People should have the right to choose where they live, regardless of any of the protected classes, as long as they qualify, as long as they can afford the housing, meet the rental criteria, which has its own set of economic and social implications. We just talked about how people have experienced historical gaps and what that means for future generations. So we have to acknowledge that. But people should be able to, if they want to live in a rural community that's, very, very small, if they want to live in a downtown high rise, if they want to live in a senior community that has the recreational therapy program that they need, if they want to move into a neighborhood that's near a particular school system, they have the right to make that offer to apply there and be treated as a serious applicant or a serious buyer, regardless of any of their protected classes. So that's, I think, something that we need to uphold and be aware of. So I really appreciate that question. I think it was Rachel that asked that. Hopefully I'm right. But people have the right to make that choice no matter what that choice is. And that's something we really want to make people aware of in terms of these are your fair housing rights. And hopefully it's a good experience, but sometimes it's not. And the good news is something can be done about it if it's related to a protected class. Oh, okay.
Rachel said, appreciate the info, but don't think I got an answer to the question. Were you looking, Rachel, more for like what it's like to live as a white person in a majority Black neighborhood or vice versa?
Yeah, I think I navigated back to her. Sorry, Rachel, the question went away from me, but I see it. Okay, and she says yes. So I'm not entirely sure that that's something I can speak to recently in Grand Rapids. I can say I grew up in the city of Detroit, and I often am asked, well, which part, like which suburb? And there's a disbelief that I, as a white person, grew up in the city of Detroit because of the stereotype or the experience that people had. So, that's my personal experience, is that, there's stereotypes and biases and assumptions. And I would be like, no, it wasn't a suburb. It was within the city. Oh, well, how many times did you get shot at? Okay, that never happened to me. I had a really strong neighborhood. It was a really diverse group of families and individuals. It was a very connected group. It was a wonderful experience. So it was really, I was taken aback when people had a very different mindset of what that was like. So, I think that's a great question to have with multiple people to better understand what that is like. My personal experience is, on the East Side. And I'm still kind of asked those questions and, kind of confronted with that. And I had such a wonderful experience that it kind of it's emotional for me to hear the negative assumptions about my experience when they don't know the truth. And so I do really appreciate, that you're asking that. And so I hope that's more on target for you. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is a really good question, and certainly
Mhm.
one that, like you said, Liz, we would want to hear from a wide variety of people to really fully answer that question.
Yeah. And it's a great dialogue point to start thinking about in terms of, we've had people say, well, I want to move into an integrated neighborhood. Where are they? And so we have to give people the understanding, we don't steer, we uphold your right to go anywhere you want. Real estate agents can't steer, we don't either. You need to identify the neighborhood that works for you, and we will do everything to uphold that choice. So I think I see how I misread your question, Rachel. But I hope that fair housing perspective is helpful there. Yeah.
And otherwise, in the comments, I'm seeing just appreciation and thanks for visuals. Skipped a meeting to attend this, and it was well worth my time. Enjoyed
It's nice
all
to hear.
the
Thank you. We
context.
won't
So,
tell. We won't tell that you skipped the meeting.
absolutely not. So, thank you very much, Liz.
Yeah. Thank you
I
so much for the
appreciate your time
opportunity.
tonight,
Yeah.
and
So
have a great night, everyone.
yes, fill out the surveys. There's two. Don't forget.